You grew up in the gritty, authentic, outer borough version of Queens, far from the polished glass of Manhattan. Your world was defined by cramped kitchens, thin walls, and the constant, rhythmic sound of your family breathing in the dark. Your father was a construction foreman, your mother a clinic nurse, and they raised four of you in a two-bedroom unit where privacy was a myth. Every night, your father returned home, his body heavy with the weight of the city. He would settle at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring into the steam, silent for 20 minutes. You watched the way his hands shook, the way he moved with a permanent, dull ache. You saw the toll of hard labor long before you could name it. It was a slow, grinding erosion of the self. By the time you were 10, you had reached a cold, quiet conclusion. You would not build with your hands. You would not trade your life for the exhaustion you saw at that kitchen table. You would build with your head. You would find a way to make the world work for you, rather than letting the world work you into the ground. That vow was the first brick in the foundation of everything you would eventually lose. In school, you were neither a star nor a failure, but you possessed a quiet, persistent ability to see the architecture of a transaction. While others studied textbooks, you studied the gaps between prices. You instinctively knew where to find cheaper goods, how to negotiate, and grasped the concept of margins long before you learned the term. By high school, you began to experiment. You bought batches of CDs from a clearance bin and flipped them to classmates for a profit. You sourced phone chargers in bulk and sold them individually. You even moved sneakers through a friend of a friend, watching the cash change hands. It was never about the money itself, it was about the mechanism. Buy low, sell high, keep the difference. This logic resonated with you because it was clean, predictable, and entirely disconnected from physical exhaustion. You were not building with your hands, you were building with information. Every successful flip was a validation, a small, tangible proof that you could navigate the world without being crushed by it. You were learning the rhythm of the market, identifying the hidden inefficiencies that others ignored. In 2003, your father pushed you towards civil engineering, convinced that construction offered the only path to stability. You did not object. You viewed college as a bureaucratic hurdle, a credential to unlock the real game. By your third year, you were working part-time at a Queens real estate office. You spent your days showing apartments, chauffeuring clients through traffic, and managing stacks of paperwork. This was not the classroom. This was the market in motion. You quickly realized that your income was no longer tethered to a fixed hourly wage. It was tied to your ability to read people. You watched how clients hesitated before a signature, how they reacted to the light in a room, and how they justified their choices. You learned to anticipate their needs before they spoke them. Every commission you earned was a direct result of your insight into their psychology. By your graduation in 2007, you had stopped showing apartments and started closing deals. You were the top agent in the office, not because you were popular, but because you were methodical. You understood the pricing, the market, and most importantly, what the client needed to hear to commit. You had finally decoupled your labor from your time, and the difference was everything. Then 2008 arrived, and the housing market collapsed with the force of a bomb. Deals evaporated overnight. Commissions vanished. Half your office staff was laid off, and your income plummeted to a fraction of its former glory. You survived the initial shock, but the reality of your position was grim. One evening, you sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea, reflecting on the day. The house was silent. You looked up and saw the same fatigue in your own reflection that you had watched in your father for 20 years. The same kitchen table, the same silence, the same exhaustion. You realized with a jolt that you were not escaping the cycle. You were merely repeating it. You were still trading your time for someone else's profit, and when the market turned, you were the one left with nothing. That moment was a fracture in your logic. You understood then that selling other people's property was a dead end. To truly get ahead, you had to own the asset yourself. you had to be the one holding the deed. You stood up, left the tea untouched, and began to calculate how to turn the wreckage of the market into your own foundation. In 2009, at 24, you saw the wreckage of the housing market not as a disaster, but as a doorway. Apartments that once sold for $400,000 were now listed at $260,000. You had $35,000 in savings, but your income on paper was too volatile for a bank to approve a mortgage. You needed a partner. You sat your mother down at the same kitchen table where you had once watched your father sit in silence. You laid out the numbers, the potential for equity, and the long-term plan. She hesitated, then signed. You found a one-bedroom unit in Jackson Heights. It had worn floors, a cramped kitchen, and a persistent draft. But it was yours. The monthly rent barely covered the mortgage and the maintenance costs. To make the math work, you moved back into your parents' home. It was crowded and humbling, but every month, the rent flowed in. You were no longer just a worker. You were a landlord. By 2011, the market had rebounded. Your equity surged, and the rent continued to flow like clockwork. You did not sell. You doubled down. In 2012, you acquired your second property, then a third, and then another. You targeted neighborhoods you knew intimately, block by block. Eastern Queens, the Bronx, and the industrial pockets of Jersey just outside the city. These were areas where the gap between mortgage payments and rental income was widest. You developed a ruthless efficiency. You painted walls with the cheapest white paint available, repaired only what was absolutely essential, and ignored everything else. You filled units rapidly, turning over leases with cold, calculated speed. You stopped thinking like an individual managing a few apartments. You began to think like a machine. Every interaction became a data point, every repair a cost to be minimized, every tenant a variable in a larger equation. You were no longer just a landlord. You were the architect of a system designed to scale. You moved through the city, identifying windows of opportunity before others even noticed the listings. You were relentless, and for the first time, you felt the weight of your own creation pulling you forward. From 2013 to 2017, you kept your day job in real estate. It was a strategic necessity. Banks favored the stability of a steady paycheck, and you needed that credibility to secure more loans. Mentally, however, the agency was no longer your career. It was a tool, a mechanism to qualify for the next mortgage. The real business was your rental portfolio. You used your own name, your mother's name, and once, even your father's. You scaled relentlessly because the math consistently worked. By 2017, you owned 15 units across New York, Jersey, and Philadelphia. Gross rental income was robust, and mortgage payments were manageable. After factoring in management fees, repairs, and utilities, you were clearing substantial money every month. You had enough to quit, and you did. You walked out of the office for the last time, leaving the desk and the commissions behind. You convinced yourself you had achieved the ultimate dream. No boss, no office, no rigid schedule, just deposits appearing in your account while you slept. You woke up at 10, scanned listings, and were finally free. But passive income, you would soon discover, harbored a dark side. The less you concerned yourself with the people residing in your properties, the more efficient your machine became. Tenants became mere numbers on a spreadsheet. Apartments transformed into sterile units. Problems were reduced to brief, annoying text messages. Human beings became nothing more than friction in your workflow. You did not want stories. You wanted payments. As long as the rent arrived on time, you asked no questions. You hired a property management company to handle the messy reality of the business. They managed the showings, the basic identity checks, the deposits, the leases, the repairs, and the complaints. You paid them 10% of the gross, a small price to ensure you never had to interact directly with a resident again. After acquiring your 7th unit, this arrangement felt like total liberation. In reality, it was a profound distance. And distance, you learned, conceals many things. You were building a wall between yourself and the life inside your walls. You were safe, you were profitable, and you were completely, dangerously blind to what was actually happening under your own roof. In 2016, you purchased a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, near Northern Boulevard. It was in excellent condition, easy to rent, and located in a high-demand area. By March 2022, your management company placed a new tenant there. His application was a masterclass in simplicity, a valid passport, a steady history, and a quiet demeanor. He paid the first month, the last month, and the security deposit without a single question or hesitation. No drama, no strange inquiries. Your manager texted you the news. Solid tenant. You replied with a single satisfied word. Great. For 13 consecutive months, the rent flowed into your account with the precision of clockwork. There were no maintenance requests, no late-night calls, no lease violations, and no noise complaints that ever reached your desk. Nothing. To you, he was the gold standard of tenants. He was invisible, reliable, and perfectly aligned with the machine you had built. You never visited, you never checked. You simply watched the balance climb. But the silence was not a sign of perfection. It was a shroud. Neighbors began to detect a sharp, chemical odor drifting through the vents, sometimes faint, sometimes pungent enough to sting the throat. One resident finally reached their limit and reported the smell to the building office. A formal warning letter was dispatched to the unit, a standard procedure for lease violations. The smell vanished for a few weeks, then returned, stronger than before. You, however, remained blissfully oblivious. The building office never contacted you directly. Your property manager did not monitor building-wide complaints, viewing them as outside the scope of their contract. Your perfectly crafted system had a gaping hole in it. A small, silent hole, but a very, very expensive one. The machine was working exactly as you designed it. It kept you away from the truth. Then came April 2023. You drove to the property for a routine meter check. It was one of those mundane, administrative errands you barely registered. A quick stop to verify the numbers before moving on to the next task. You pulled into the street, scanned the building, and found a spot near the entrance. You grabbed your phone, checked the unit number one last time, and stepped out of the car. The morning air felt sharp, the street quiet, exactly as you expected. You took 2 steps toward the curb, your mind already calculating the next property on your list. Then, the rhythm of the day shattered. 3 men materialized from the shadows near the building entrance. They did not walk toward you. They converged, cutting off your path to the door. 2 were in uniform, their presence heavy and immediate. The third, in plain clothes, held a folder that looked out of place against the brick. You stopped. Your hand tightened around your phone. They were waiting for you. The lead officer moved first, his pace steady, closing the distance before you could process the shift in the air. He did not offer a greeting. He held up a badge, the metal catching the morning light, and pointed toward the building entrance. "Are you the owner of Unit 4B? The question hit you like a physical weight. You nodded, your voice catching in your throat as you confirmed your identity. The investigator in plain clothes stepped forward, his eyes scanning your face for a reaction you had not yet formed. He gestured toward an unmarked car parked a few yards away. "We need you to come with us," he said. The request was not a negotiation. You moved toward the vehicle, the pavement feeling uneven beneath your feet. Inside the car, the air was stagnant, smelling of stale coffee and cold plastic. They did not waste time with pleasantries. They laid out the situation with clinical, terrifying precision. "Sublease," they said. "Production site." Then, the final word landed with the force of a physical blow. "Narcotics." The world outside the window blurred. The machine you had built had just collapsed. The police station was a sterile, windowless room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. You sat at a metal table, your hands flat against the cold surface, waiting for the silence to break. The investigator sat opposite you, his movements deliberate. He reached into a folder and slid a series of photographs across the table. You looked down, expecting to see the familiar layout of your property. You recognized the bathroom tiles, the shape of the hallway, and the specific pattern of the kitchen floor, but the space was unrecognizable. Every room had been stripped of its domestic purpose. Industrial ventilation systems snaked across the ceiling, thick tubing running into the walls. The windows were completely blacked out, sealed with heavy-duty plastic that blocked every trace of natural light. Specialized filters and chemical vats occupied the living area, where a couch should have been. It was professional. It was meticulous. It was a fully operational laboratory. You stared at the images, tracing the lines of the equipment, trying to reconcile the unit you rented with the crime scene in the photos. The quiet efficiency you had once prized was now the very thing that had allowed this to happen. The investigator leaned forward, the fluorescent light above him humming with a sharp, rhythmic buzz. He tapped the table, his eyes locked onto yours. "Did you know?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of a verdict. You denied it, your voice sounding thin against the cold walls. He did not blink. He began to dissect your timeline, his questions moving with surgical precision. When was the last time you were inside the unit? Past. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. You had no answer that would not sound like an admission of failure. You had built a machine designed specifically to keep you away, to ensure you never had to step foot in your own properties. You had valued the distance, the lack of friction, the automated payments. Now, that same distance was being presented back to you as evidence of criminal negligence. The investigator's expression hardened. He was no longer looking at a victim of a bad tenant. He was looking at a landlord who had abandoned his duty. Every detail of your management strategy, once a point of pride, was being reframed as a deliberate choice to look the other way. You were trapped by your own efficiency. The investigator stood up, walked to the door, and returned with a single, laminated file. He dropped it onto the table with a dull thud. "The man you rented to," he said, his voice devoid of empathy, "does not exist." You stared at the passport copy in the file. The name, the date of birth, the address, all of it was a fabrication. The identity had been purchased on the black market years ago, a ghost document designed to vanish the moment the police arrived. The management company's standard check had been useless. The document was technically valid but entirely hollow. The investigator leaned in close. He didn't just rent your unit, he used you as a buffer. The tenant had orchestrated a fake sublease to create layers of distance between himself and the production site. You were not just an oblivious landlord. You were a deliberate layer of insulation, a legitimate name on a deed to shield the real orchestrators from scrutiny. The realization hit you with the force of a physical blow. You had spent years building a system to remove yourself from the equation, and that very system had made you the perfect, unwitting shield for a criminal organization. You were a pawn. The station doors swung open, but you were not free. You were merely entering a different kind of confinement. For 8 months, your life was consumed by a relentless cycle of depositions, legal filings, and mandatory interviews. You were not charged with drug trafficking, but the distinction provided little comfort. The investigation into the lab had exposed your management practices to the public eye. The fallout was immediate. Neighbors who had suffered from the chemical fumes filed civil lawsuits, claiming you had ignored their warnings. The legal fees began to mount, draining the reserves you had spent years accumulating. Every hour you spent with lawyers was an hour the machine was not running. The portfolio, once a source of pride, became a liability. You watched as your bank accounts were frozen and your assets were scrutinized. The empire was not just stalling. It was being dismantled piece by piece. You realized then that the law did not care about your intent. It cared about the paperwork, the oversight, and the damage. You were caught in a legal crossfire, and the walls of your own creation closed in tighter. Just as the civil lawsuits began to drain your remaining capital, the second wave arrived. It was not a knock at the door, but a formal notice from the tax authorities. The investigation into the laboratory had inadvertently triggered a comprehensive audit of your entire rental portfolio. They did not just look at the Queen's unit. They looked at everything. Years of underreported rental income, hidden management fees, and creative accounting practices were laid bare. The math that had once felt like a brilliant strategy now appeared as a trail of red flags. The penalties were immediate and astronomical. Interest accrued on back taxes, compounding with every passing day. You watched your cash flow evaporate into a void of debt. The machine you had built to secure your future was now the very engine of your financial destruction. You were no longer the owner of an empire. You were a debtor, trapped in a system that was systematically reclaiming every dollar you had ever earned. The end arrived not with a bang, but with a single typewritten line in a case file. 8 months of terror, a year and a half of litigation, and 14 years of building an empire, all distilled into one sentence of bureaucratic summary. The tenant was sentenced to years behind bars, and his network was dismantled, but the damage to your life was permanent. The passive income dream had not just stalled, it had collapsed into a mountain of debt. You stood in the center of the wreckage, watching as the system you once manipulated turned its full force against you. The properties remained, but they were no longer yours in any meaningful sense. They were collateral, assets to be liquidated. Without your oversight, it had become a liability that consumed your past, your savings, and your future. The silence in your kitchen returned, but it was no longer the silence of reflection. It was the silence of total, absolute loss. The apartments still stand. Most are still rented, but the machine has changed. I no longer outsource the eyes that watch the doors. Every other month, I walk the halls, check the locks, and speak to the neighbors. The profit margins are thinner, the hours are longer, and the work is relentless. I thought my mistake was trusting a single, deceptive tenant. I was wrong. The mistake was building a system designed to reward me for looking away. I constructed a life that demanded my absence, and in that absence, I invited the disaster that dismantled everything. Now, there is no passive income. There is only the work, the presence, and the heavy cost of having finally learned how to see.